His boots echoed on cobblestones slick with rain, the sharp cry of a duel slicing through the dawn mist. This wasn't a movie set. It was real. It was London. And it was a street that no longer exists. In this video, we're stepping back into Wych Street, a place so soaked in stories, scandal and shadow that it was once called the soul of old London. Taverns roared with laughter and crime. Bookshops whispered forbidden words, and hidden in the crowd, a young man who would become America's first multi-millionaire tuned pianos by candlelight. You didn't just click on a forgotten street. You've opened a door to a world that was buried on purpose. It's hard to believe now, standing on the wide, polished stretch of Kingsway, that this was once one of London's most atmospheric streets. Long before steel and stone replaced it, Wych Street was a narrow medieval passage lined with timbered houses, crooked taverns, and secrets hidden in every shadow. It had no grandeur by today's standards, but it had something far more powerful, a heartbeat. Wych Street didn't just connect Holborn and the Strand, it connected centuries of life, threading through the daily footsteps of lawyers, actors, thieves, booksellers, and drunks. The upper floors of its Elizabethan buildings jutted out, nearly touching each other across the street, darkening the road below. This was London before the fire, before the empire, before the glass towers, and yet almost no trace of it remains. Demolished in the early 20th century, Wych Street was erased in the name of modernisation. In its place came Kingsway, part of a grand plan to improve traffic flow and give the city a more respectable look. Victorian officials saw it as a civic upgrade, but in truth it was a cultural amputation. Only fragments survived. St Clement Danes Church still stands where the street once began, its walls scarred by bombings during the Blitz. Walk past it today and you're tracing the ghost of Wych Street, heading toward what is now Australia House. Where embassies and office blocks sit now, there were once crooked signs swinging in the wind, the sound of boots on stone, and barmaids singing bawdy songs to laughing crowds. Wych Street was a contradiction in motion, a place where the upper and lower classes collided, not out of civility, but out of necessity. It housed the kind of raw, unfiltered London that rarely makes it into history books. And yet, it was also the kind of street that inspired Charles Dickens to create the world of Bleak House. For centuries, it survived neglect, fire, and change. But in 1901, it lost the only battle it couldn't win, the one against progress. And so, like a fading memory, Wych Street was flattened, paved over, and almost entirely forgotten. But the ghosts remain, if you know where to look. If Wych Street was the spine of old London, Holywell Street was the hidden chapter everyone wanted to read, but no one dared to speak of. Just off the main road, it looked like any other cramped alley, but it pulsed with energy, danger, and desire. It was here in the shadows of the city that Victorian London found its most scandalous escape: books. By the mid-19th century, Holywell Street had earned a notorious reputation as the capital of illicit literature. Behind fogged-up shop windows and under shelves thick with dust, you could find anything the censors didn't want you to read: pornography, heretical texts, banned political pamphlets, even secret philosophical works. All printed, sold, and circulated just a stone's throw from the legal heart of the British Empire. The irony was stunning. On one side of the street, barristers studied scripture. On the other, smugglers sold erotica wrapped in newspapers to passing clergymen. The trade was so brazen that Holywell Street was nicknamed Booksellers' Row, although what they were selling was rarely just books. In one of the more bizarre twists, publishers learned to disguise their products. Explicit novels were printed with religious-looking covers. Others were bound inside decoy volumes like sermons on patience. There were even underground catalogues passed by hand, guiding customers to the spiciest corners of the city's literary underworld. What kept Holywell Street alive wasn't just demand, it was the thrill. Buying from here meant you were breaking rules, peeking behind the curtain of Victorian hypocrisy. You could be a gentleman by day and a sinner by page-turning night. Some of the country's most respected figures were regulars, slipping in and out unnoticed. By the 1870s, reformers and police had taken aim at the street, but enforcement was slippery. Raids were often tipped off in advance. Fines were written off as business expenses. One bookseller famously said, "They can take the books, but they'll never stop the reading." When Wych Street and Holywell Street were demolished, it wasn't just urban space that was cleared. It was a purge of everything unruly, erotic, and untamed in the city's past. And yet, for a few brief decades, this little alley told the truth about a London that the history books tried hard to forget. What kind of man steals from the rich, escapes 4 prisons, and still gets cheered by the crowd on his way to execution? Jack Sheppard was never supposed to be remembered. He was a poor apprentice, barely literate, living on the fringes of society. And yet, for 2 unforgettable years, he became the most wanted man in London and its most unlikely folk hero. His story plays out in the very streets this video uncovers, especially Wych Street, where the line between criminal and celebrity was dangerously thin. At 17, Jack was working under a carpenter named Mr. Owen Wood, near the old Inns of Court. That's where he met Edgeworth Bess, a woman whose beauty was matched only by her criminal savvy. She pulled him into the underworld, and he never looked back. Soon, Jack was drinking in the Black Lion Tavern just off Drury Lane, brushing shoulders with thieves like Blueskin and the infamous Jonathan Wild. But it wasn't the robberies that made Jack famous, it was the escapes. He slipped out of prison 4 times in just 2 years. Iron bars, picked, brick walls, climbed, locked doors, unlocked. One of his most legendary breakouts involved chiselling through a wall, crawling across a roof, and vanishing into the fog before anyone realised he was gone. Each escape was like a performance, and London couldn't look away. Crowds followed his trials, newspapers sold out when his name was in the headlines. Children played Jack Sheppard in the streets. He wasn't just a criminal. He was a symbol of defiance, especially to the poor, who saw him as someone who beat the system, if only for a while. When he was finally captured for the last time, the city braced for the spectacle. On the day of his hanging in 1724, tens of thousands gathered. Some claim Edgeworth Bess had bribed a surgeon to resuscitate him after the hanging, but the mob was too thick. The plan failed. Jack died, and yet his story lived on. In a city obsessed with law and order, Jack Sheppard became the exception people rooted for. And it was in the crooked lanes of Wych Street where his legend was born, sung and whispered for generations. Wych Street was never just a road. It was a living timeline where law, theatre and crime collided beneath the same sagging rooftops. And nowhere is that blend more visible than in its evolution from legal stronghold to cultural playground. It began with Lions Inn, nestled just off Wych Street. Once part of London's medieval legal education system, this was where young men came to learn the law, board with barristers, and begin their journey toward respectability. One of its most famous students, Sir Thomas More, long before he would lose his head to Henry VIII. But even the sharpest minds couldn't keep Lions Inn from decline. By the 1700s, what had once been a place of scholarly ambition had slipped into disrepute. Gambling, drinking, swindling. Lions Inn had become a gathering place not for future judges, but for men who had nothing left to wager except reputation. And yet you might ask, how could a place built on order so easily fall into chaos? That's Wych Street. It never obeyed just one version of London. As the law faded, the stage rose. Theatres replaced courtrooms, and laughter echoed where lectures once rang. The Olympic Theatre, built in 1806 on the site of the former Drury House, was more than just a venue. It was a symbol of transformation. Some said it was constructed using timber from a captured French warship. A poetic irony, perhaps, that a house once dedicated to conquest now entertained with satire and song. And what of the people who gathered here? Across from the theatre stood the Shakespeare's Head, a tavern steeped in stories. Mark Lemon, founding editor of Punch magazine, lived upstairs for a year. Did he write satire inspired by the drunks below? Did the city's absurdity seep through the floorboards as he worked? Wych Street didn't just house creativity, it fermented it. So what held this place together? Was it tradition, rebellion, or simply the fact that Wych Street made room for both? From black-robed legal apprentices to costumed actors and editorial outcasts, this street blurred the line between discipline and performance. Today, standing where Kingsway now cuts through the city, you'd never guess that beneath the traffic and glass lies the memory of a street that once held the scales of justice in one hand and a stage script in the other. What does a city lose when it demolishes a street? Not just buildings, not just space. It loses memory. Wych Street may no longer appear on any map, but its absence still echoes through the stone and steel of modern London. By 1901, the city was hungry for progress. Planners spoke of hygiene, efficiency, traffic flow. And so the crooked lanes of Wych Street, full of timbered houses, sagging inns and centuries-old secrets, were flattened. In their place rose Kingsway, a broad, straight avenue meant to represent the new London. Clean, symmetrical, modern. But did the future really need to erase the past so completely? At the time, no one thought to preserve it. There were no protections for historic architecture, no movements calling for conservation. The Victorians were clearing slums, not cataloguing heritage. And Wych Street, with its dark alleys, bawdy taverns and outlaw tales, didn't fit the narrative of a rising empire. It was deemed expendable. Still, this wasn't just a matter of urban design. It was a cultural incision. Wych Street had been a convergence of theatre and law, rebellion and literature, crime and creativity. It held the kind of energy that doesn't survive in straight lines and polished facades. Now, most who walk down Kingsway feel nothing. They don't know that Jack Shepherd once ran through here with guards at his heels. They don't hear the barmaids singing from the steps of the rising sun, or see the shadow of a theatre built from a French warship's bones. They pass modern buildings with no idea of the fire that once lived beneath them. But if you pause, just briefly, and let the present quiet itself, you might still sense something stirring. A street that refused to conform, a London that wasn't made to be tidy. Wych Street wasn't preserved, but its story survived in the margins, carried by memory and myth. And it leaves us with one final question. When we rebuild our cities, what exactly are we choosing to remember? And what are we choosing to erase? We walk past glass towers and wide roads thinking we know the city. But sometimes, the most powerful parts of its story are the ones that were buried, flattened to make way for something more modern, more efficient, more forgettable. Wych Street wasn't perfect. It was loud, messy, unpredictable. But maybe that's exactly what made it so human. Its disappearance reminds us that cities aren't just built with stone, they're built with memory. And memory fades unless someone keeps it alive. Now it's your turn to step into that story. Did Wych Street deserve to survive, or was its demolition the price of progress? And what other forgotten corners of history do you think we should uncover next? Let us know in the comments. We read them all. And if this video helped you see London in a new light, leave a like and a comment to help more people discover this story. That small action tells YouTube this video matters, and it helps bring forgotten places like Wych Street back into the light. Thanks for watching.